Welcome, traveler. Tonight we are in Alexandria. The year is 48 BC. The Mediterranean is calm beneath a sky full of stars, and in the royal palace, on a terrace overlooking the harbor, a young woman stands alone. She is 21 years old. She is the Queen of Egypt. Her name is Cleopatra, and somewhere out on that dark sea, a fleet is approaching, carrying a Roman general whose name will one day be known everywhere. Tonight, before everything changes, she simply watches the water. Come and stand beside her. Let the ancient harbor carry you to sleep. The royal palace of Alexandria sits on a peninsula extending into the harbor, with views in multiple directions across the Mediterranean and across the city itself. Cleopatra stands on a terrace on the palace's seaward side, a wide stone platform open to the sky with a low wall at its edge that overlooks a considerable drop to the water below. The terrace is one of her favorite places in the palace, has been since she was a child, brought here by nurses or tutors during the long, hot Alexandrian days, allowed to look out at the sea while adults discussed matters she did not then fully understand. Tonight, the terrace is empty except for her. Though not unguarded, several attendants remain at a discreet distance near the entrance back into the palace proper, present but not intrusive, the way that royal attendants learn to be present. The night is warm. Alexandria's nights, even in what would be considered autumn elsewhere, retain much of summer's warmth, the Mediterranean climate moderating temperatures in ways that the more extreme climate of inland Egypt does not experience. A light breeze comes off the water, carrying the particular smell of the sea, mixed with the smells of the city itself. Wood smoke from countless fires, the lingering smells of the day's commerce and cooking, the underlying smell of a city built partly on reclaimed land, where sea and city intermingle in ways visible and invisible. The harbor itself is visible from this terrace, the famous harbor of Alexandria, one of the great harbors of the ancient world, protected by the island of Pharos and the enormous lighthouse that stands upon it, visible even at night as a point of light, the fire at its summit burning continuously, guiding ships towards safe harbor. Tonight, that lighthouse's fire burns as it always burns. But tonight, Cleopatra is watching the sea beyond the harbor, the open water where, according to the reports that have been reaching the palace for days, a fleet is approaching. Cleopatra is 21 years old. She became queen 4 years ago, at 17, following the death of her father, Ptolemy XII. The years since have been, even by the standards of Ptolemaic Egypt, where political instability had been a recurring feature for generations, extraordinarily difficult. She had initially ruled jointly with her younger brother, Ptolemy XIII, as Egyptian and Ptolemaic tradition required, a sibling co-rule that was, in practice, less a partnership than a power struggle, complicated by the involvement of court officials and advisors who had their own interests in how this struggle resolved. This struggle had, within a relatively short time, escalated into open conflict. Cleopatra had been forced from Alexandria, had spent time in exile, gathering what support she could, while her brother's faction controlled the capital. And now, in the midst of this Egyptian civil war, Roman politics had intervened in a manner that had transformed the situation into something considerably larger and more dangerous than a simple dynastic struggle. Rome itself was in the midst of civil war. the conflict between Julius Caesar and Pompey the Great, two of Rome's most powerful figures, had escalated into open warfare that had drawn in much of the Mediterranean world, as various client kingdoms and provinces found themselves, willingly or not, drawn into taking sides. Pompey, defeated by Caesar in a major battle in Greece some weeks ago, had fled and had come to Egypt seeking refuge, based on old connections between his family and the Ptolemaic dynasty. What had happened to Pompey upon his arrival in Egypt? Cleopatra knows this, has known it for days now, though the knowledge remains, even now, something she has not fully processed, is that he had been killed by order of the faction controlling Alexandria in her brother's name, acting, they apparently believed, in a manner that would please the victorious Caesar, by eliminating his defeated rival, and now Caesar himself, pursuing Pompey, unaware, or so it was assumed, that Pompey was already dead, was approaching Alexandria with a fleet, with Roman soldiers, arriving within days, possibly within hours, at a city already divided by civil war, already destabilized, now confronting the arrival of the most powerful man in the Roman world, a world that held power, ultimately, over Egypt itself, regardless of Egypt's nominal independence. Cleopatra stands on her terrace, looking at the dark sea, thinking about all of this. What does Cleopatra actually know about Julius Caesar, the man whose fleet approaches even now? She has gathered information. This is something she has done systematically since becoming queen, understanding that information about the major Roman figures is essential to navigating Egypt's relationship with Rome, a relationship that has, for generations, been central to Ptolemaic survival. Caesar is, by reputation, an extraordinary military commander. His campaigns in Gaul over the preceding decade have expanded Roman territory enormously, and have made him, among the Roman military men of his generation, perhaps the most accomplished. He is also, by reputation, ambitious in ways that go beyond military accomplishment. His recent actions, crossing into Italy with his army in defiance of the Senate, precipitating the civil war with Pompey, suggest a man who is willing to take extraordinary risks, who does not operate within the conventional boundaries that Roman political tradition would normally impose. He is, by reputation, intelligent, not simply militarily capable, but genuinely sophisticated, interested in history, in literature, in the kind of cultural matters that Alexandria, with its famous library and its reputation as a center of learning, particularly prizes. He is, by reputation, charming, capable of personal relationships, of inspiring loyalty in ways that go beyond simple command authority. And he is, by reputation, and this is something Cleopatra has thought about specifically, given her own situation, a man who has had significant relationships with women of considerable influence and intelligence. Not simply the conventional marriages of Roman political life, but relationships that suggest he values, or at least finds compelling, women who are not merely ornamental. Cleopatra has thought about what all of this might mean for her specific situation. She is queen, nominally, but queen of a kingdom currently divided by civil war, with her own position precarious, dependent on factors she cannot fully control. Caesar arrives in the midst of all this, as the most powerful man in the world that matters most to Egypt's continued existence, as anything other than a Roman province outright. How Caesar's arrival is handled by her brother's faction, by Egypt as a whole, could determine in ways that feel almost too large to fully think through the future not just of her own position, but of Egypt's relationship with Rome for years or decades to come. She stands on her terrace, watching the sea, thinking about all of this. Behind her, the city of Alexandria spreads out, visible from this elevated terrace, as a pattern of lights across a considerable area. Alexandria is, by the standards of the ancient world, an enormous city, founded some 3 centuries earlier by Alexander the Great, developed by successive Ptolemaic rulers into one of the great cities of the Mediterranean, rivaling and in some respects exceeding even Rome itself in terms of population, in terms of cultural and intellectual significance. The city's grid pattern, unusual for ancient cities, most of which grew organically rather than according to planned designs, is visible even at night. The lights tracing the major streets in patterns that Cleopatra has known her entire life, that she could navigate blindfolded, in the way that people know the layouts of places that have always been home. The library, the great library of Alexandria, repository of an enormous collection of texts, center of scholarly activity that draws thinkers from across the known world, is somewhere in that pattern of lights, though Cleopatra cannot specifically identify its location from this distance. In darkness, she has spent considerable time in the library over the years, has access, as queen, to its resources in ways that even most scholars do not have. Has read in multiple languages. She is famously multilingual, fluent not only in Greek, the language of the Ptolemaic court, but also in Egyptian and in several other languages relevant to Egypt's diplomatic relationships, including she has made a point of learning at least some Latin, the language of Rome. The museum, associated with the library, a center for scholarly research and, in some respects, an early version of what later eras might recognize as a research institution, is also somewhere in the city's pattern, though again not specifically visible from here. The harbor itself, the great harbor, where the lighthouse stands, where ships from across the Mediterranean arrive and depart, carrying the trade that is one of the foundations of Alexandria's wealth and significance. All of this, the library, the museum, the harbor, the grid of streets, the considerable population, estimates suggest several 100,000 people, though precise figures are difficult to establish, exists tonight in a state of considerable tension. The civil war between Cleopatra and her brother's faction has not been resolved. The killing of Pompey has introduced an entirely new and dangerous element, and now Caesar's fleet approaches, bringing with it uncertainty about how all of these existing tensions will be affected by the arrival of Roman military power, deployed by a man whose own position in Rome's ongoing civil war remains itself somewhat uncertain. Cleopatra looks at the city's lights, the visible expression of all these hundreds of thousands of lives, continuing tonight in whatever ways individual lives continue, regardless of the larger political dramas unfolding around and above them. Most of these people, she thinks, do not know that Caesar's fleet approaches. Will learn of it tomorrow or in the days following, as the news spreads through the city in whatever ways news spreads. Official announcements, certainly, but also rumor, speculation, the countless informal channels through which information moves through a large population. For tonight, though, the city simply continues, its lights, its sounds, faint from this height and distance but present, the underlying hum of a large population, even at night, never entirely silent, its ongoing existence, unaware of what tomorrow specifically will bring, though aware in the general sense that the entire city has been aware for weeks now that significant events are unfolding, that the situation is unstable, that change of some kind is coming. Cleopatra thinks sometimes, and tonight is one of those times, about her childhood in this palace. She was not, as a child, expected to become queen in the manner she eventually did. She had older siblings, though the specific dynamics of Ptolemaic succession, complicated by the dynasty's practice of sibling marriages and the resulting complex webs of relationship and rivalry, meant that expected is itself a complicated word in this context. Her father, Ptolemy XII, had himself faced significant challenges to his rule, had at one point been forced into exile, had needed Roman support to be restored to his throne, a restoration that had come at considerable cost, both financial, enormous debts to Roman creditors, debts that continue to affect Egypt's finances even now, and in terms of Egypt's effective independence, the increasing reality that Ptolemaic Egypt's continued existence depended, in ways that were not always openly acknowledged, but that everyone with any political awareness understood, on Roman tolerance. Cleopatra had observed all of this as a child and young woman, had watched her father navigate the complex relationship with Rome, had absorbed, in the way that children absorb the political realities of the households they grow up in, the understanding that Egypt's position in the world was not simply a matter of Egypt's own resources and traditions, however considerable and ancient those were, but was fundamentally shaped by Egypt's relationship with the rising power of Rome. She had also, as a child, received an education that was, by the standards of the time, extraordinary, not simply the education appropriate to a Ptolemaic princess in terms of court protocols and traditional knowledge, but a broader education that included, as mentioned, multiple languages, but also extended to history, to philosophy, to the kind of intellectual training that Alexandria's reputation as a center of learning made available to those with access to its resources. She remembers, from childhood, walking through parts of the palace complex with tutors, discussing, in Greek primarily, though sometimes in other languages as part of language instruction, various subjects, the history of Egypt under previous dynasties, going back thousands of years before the Ptolemaic period, the history of Alexander the Great, founder of the city, and, in a sense, founder of the dynasty that Cleopatra belongs to, though the Ptolemaic dynasty descends from one of Alexander's generals rather than from Alexander himself. The current political situation, including Rome's growing influence. She remembers specifically a conversation, she believes she was perhaps 12 or 13 at the time, with one of her tutors, about the nature of power. The tutor had made a point that Cleopatra has thought about many times since, that power in the world as it actually exists is rarely about simple force alone, that the most effective rulers throughout history have been those who understood not just how to command, but how to be understood, how to communicate, in ways appropriate to different audiences, in ways that built the kind of relationships and loyalties that simple force cannot create. This lesson about the importance of understanding, of communication, of relationships, as tools of power alongside more conventional military and political tools, has remained with Cleopatra, has shaped, in ways she is aware of, how she has approached the challenges of her own reign, including, she thinks now, standing on this terrace, the challenge that tomorrow, or whenever Caesar actually arrives, will present. The reports about Caesar's approaching fleet have been arriving for several days now, initially vague, based on sightings from coastal lookout points along Egypt's Mediterranean coast, gradually becoming more specific as the fleet's progress has continued. Cleopatra has reviewed these reports carefully, has discussed them with her advisors, the small group of trusted individuals who have remained loyal to her through the recent difficulties, who form, in effect, her court in exile, though exile is perhaps not quite accurate, given the complex and shifting nature of control over Alexandria itself during the recent civil war. What the reports indicate, Caesar's fleet is relatively small. By Roman standards, this is not a massive invasion force, but rather what appears to be a force appropriate to pursuing a defeated enemy, Pompey, rather than to conducting a major military campaign against Egypt itself. This is, Cleopatra and her advisors have discussed, potentially significant. If Caesar's primary purpose is pursuing Pompey, and if Caesar does not yet know that Pompey is dead, then Caesar's initial intentions toward Egypt itself may be relatively limited, perhaps simply to demand Egyptian cooperation in locating and dealing with Pompey, perhaps to use Alexandria as a base for further operations, but not necessarily intending any larger intervention in Egypt's internal affairs. On the other hand, and this is the consideration that makes the situation genuinely uncertain, Caesar's arrival, regardless of his initial intentions, introduces an enormous variable into Egypt's already unstable internal situation. The faction controlling Alexandria, acting in Ptolemy XIII's name, has already taken the dramatic step of killing Pompey, apparently believing this would please Caesar, but a calculation that could prove badly mistaken if Caesar's reaction is different than anticipated. Romans, Cleopatra understands, do not necessarily approve of the killing of a fellow Roman, even a defeated enemy, by foreign hands. There are questions of honor, of precedent, that could make this killing a liability rather than the gift it was apparently intended as. And Cleopatra herself, currently in a position of considerable uncertainty, her own claim to the throne contested by her brother's faction, faces the question of how Caesar's arrival might affect her own situation. Could Caesar's intervention, if it occurs, work in her favor? Could it work against her? Much depends on factors that, from her current position, she cannot fully predict or control. What she can control to some degree is how she presents herself, if and when she has the opportunity to do so, to Caesar himself. This is something she has been thinking about in the days since the fleet's approach became known, not in terms of any specific plan. The situation remains too uncertain for specific plans to be developed with any confidence, but in terms of preparation, perhaps, understanding as much as possible who this man is, what might matter to him, how the lessons of her education, about communication, about relationships, about the kinds of power that exist beyond simple military force, might be relevant if circumstances allow. The palace itself tonight exists in a state that Cleopatra has come to recognize over recent months as a kind of suspended tension, not open conflict, not resolution, but a waiting, an uncertainty about how the underlying conflicts will eventually express themselves. Her brother, Ptolemy XIII, 13 years old, technically her co-ruler, though the actual exercise of power has, throughout the recent conflict, been managed primarily by the regents and advisors who control access to him, particularly a court official named Pothinus, who has emerged as perhaps the most significant figure in the faction opposing Cleopatra. Cleopatra's relationship with her brother is complicated. They are, after all, siblings, despite the dynastic conflict that has placed them in opposition. She remembers him as a child, remembers, before the current conflict escalated, periods of what might be called normal sibling interaction, however complicated by their respective positions and the ambitions of the adults around them. The current situation has, in effect, separated them, not simply physically, though there has been physical separation during Cleopatra's period of exile from Alexandria, but in terms of the roles they now occupy, roles shaped by forces larger than either of them individually, the ongoing struggle for power that has characterized Ptolemaic succession for generations. Tonight, somewhere in this same palace complex, her brother is also aware of Caesar's approaching fleet, is also presumably considering what this arrival might mean for his own position, for the faction that currently controls Alexandria's government in his name. Cleopatra does not know exactly what her brother, or more accurately, the advisors who effectively direct policy in his name, are planning in response to Caesar's arrival. There has been, she understands, considerable discussion. The killing of Pompey was itself the result of such discussion, a calculated, though, as discussed, potentially badly calculated, attempt to position the Alexandrian government favorably with respect to the victorious Caesar. Whether similar calculations are being made now regarding how to handle Caesar's actual arrival in the city, Cleopatra does not have direct access to these discussions, given her current position outside the formal structures of government that her brother's faction controls. But she is aware, has been aware for some time, that the situation in the palace, beneath its surface of formal protocols and ongoing administrative functions, is one of considerable underlying tension. Multiple factions, multiple sets of interests, multiple calculations about how to navigate a situation that has already proven, with the killing of Pompey, capable of producing actions whose consequences may prove very different from what was intended. She thinks about all of this, standing on her terrace. Tomorrow, or whenever Caesar's fleet actually arrives, which based on the most recent reports could be within a day, perhaps less, all of these underlying tensions will be tested in ways that no one, including Cleopatra herself, can fully predict. Cleopatra's attention, for a while, settles on the lighthouse, the great pharos, visible from her terrace as a tower rising from the small island that gives it its name, connected to the mainland by a causeway, its summit burning with the fire that has guided ships into Alexandria's harbor for generations. The pharos is, by any measure, an extraordinary structure, one of the tallest buildings in the ancient world, a feat of engineering that has made it already something of a wonder, spoken of by travelers from across the Mediterranean and beyond. Cleopatra has been inside the pharos, has climbed on more than one occasion as a child and young woman the long internal ramps that spiral upward through the structure, has stood near the summit, looking out at views that extend on clear days for considerable distances across the sea and across the city and the surrounding region. She thinks, looking at the lighthouse now, about its purpose, guiding ships safely into harbor, preventing the kind of disasters that, without such guidance, would be far more common given the hazards, shoals, currents, the simple difficulty of navigation at night or in poor visibility. That Alexandria's harbor, like harbors everywhere, presents to approaching vessels. Tonight, somewhere out there in the darkness beyond the harbor, Caesar's fleet is presumably making its way toward Alexandria, and the Pharos' fire, burning as it always burns, will guide that fleet, just as it guides every other vessel, toward the harbor entrance. There is something in this thought that Cleopatra finds, on reflection, somewhat striking. The Pharos does not discriminate, does not guide only friendly vessels, only vessels whose arrival is welcomed. It simply provides light, guidance, for whoever approaches, whatever their purpose. In a sense, she thinks, this is not entirely unlike the broader reality of Alexandria's position, a great city, a center of trade and learning, open, by necessity as much as by choice, to vessels and visitors from across the known world, including now vessels carrying the representatives of a power whose intentions toward Egypt remain uncertain. The lighthouse's fire burns steadily, as it has burned for generations, as it will presumably continue to burn regardless of what happens in the coming days, regardless of who controls Alexandria, regardless of the outcomes of the various conflicts, Egyptian, Roman, that are currently converging on this city. There is something almost comforting, Cleopatra finds, in this continuity, this steady point of light, doing what it has always done, indifferent, in the way that structures are indifferent, lacking the kind of awareness that living things possess, to the human dramas unfolding around it. She watches the fire for a while, its steady glow visible across the distance, before her attention returns to the darker waters beyond, where, somewhere, the approaching fleet continues its progress toward this harbor, toward this light, toward whatever comes next. The sky above Alexandria, on a clear night like this one, offers an extraordinary view of the stars. The relatively low latitude, combined with the typically clear weather of the eastern Mediterranean in this season, providing visibility that Cleopatra has always found, in whatever moments she has had to simply look upward, genuinely impressive. She has some knowledge of astronomy. This, too, is part of the education available through Alexandria's intellectual resources, the museum and library housing scholars who study the movements of celestial bodies with considerable sophistication, building on traditions that extend back through Egyptian, Babylonian, and Greek astronomical knowledge, traditions that Alexandrian scholars have been working to synthesize and extend. She knows, for instance, that certain stars and constellations are associated, in various traditions, with specific meanings, omens, in some interpretations, though Cleopatra's own relationship with such interpretations is somewhat complex. She takes seriously the political and social significance of astrological beliefs. Many people, including many of her own subjects, take such things very seriously, and a ruler ignores popular beliefs at her peril, without necessarily believing, herself, that the positions of stars directly determine the outcomes of human affairs. Tonight, looking up at the stars, she finds herself thinking less about specific astrological meanings and more about something simpler, the sheer scale of what she is looking at. The stars, vast in number, at distances that even the most sophisticated astronomical calculations of her time can only partially comprehend, continuing in their movements, regardless of anything happening on the relatively tiny scale of human affairs. even affairs as significant, from a human perspective, as the conflicts currently converging on Alexandria. There is something in this thought, the vast scale of the stars, contrasted with the immediate pressing scale of human political crisis, that Cleopatra finds, standing on her terrace tonight, oddly clarifying. The crisis she faces, the civil war, her brother's faction, the killing of Pompey, Caesar's approaching fleet, is from any human perspective enormously significant. It will likely determine her own fate and Egypt's fate for years to come, regardless of how it resolves. And yet, from the perspective of the stars above, indifferent, continuing in their ancient patterns regardless of human affairs, this crisis is, in some sense, simply one more event among countless events that have occurred on this small world beneath these vast skies, over the long span of time that the stars themselves represent. This is not a thought that resolves the crisis or tells her what to do about it. The crisis remains exactly as significant in human terms as it was before she looked up at the stars. But there is something in the contrast between the urgency of human affairs and the vast indifference of the cosmos that provides for Cleopatra in this moment a kind of perspective, a reminder that whatever happens in the coming days, however significant it may be for her personally and for Egypt, it occurs within a context, the world, the universe, time itself, that is larger than any single crisis, however large that crisis may loom from within it. She finds this thought, oddly, calming, not because it makes the crisis less important, but because it provides a kind of frame, a way of holding the immediate urgency alongside a broader awareness that, whatever happens, the stars will continue, the world will continue, in ways that extend far beyond the specific outcomes of her own situation. Cleopatra has thought, though without any specific plan, given the genuine uncertainty about what circumstances will actually present themselves, about what she might say if she finds herself in a position to communicate directly with Caesar. This thinking is not, she would clarify if asked, primarily strategic in the narrow sense, not a calculated speech designed to manipulate, though she is certainly aware that any communication she might have with Caesar will occur within a context where both parties are, inevitably, considering their own interests and positions. Rather, it is more about understanding, about what kind of communication might actually be meaningful, might actually establish the kind of relationship, the lesson from her childhood tutor about power and relationships and communication returns to her thinking here, that could serve both Egypt's interests and, if circumstances allow, her own position within Egypt's internal conflicts. She thinks about Caesar's reputation, his interest in history, in culture, in the kind of intellectual matters that Alexandria represents. She thinks about the fact that, whatever his immediate purposes in coming to Egypt, pursuing Pompey, dealing with the diplomatic and political complications that Pompey's death, if Caesar learns of it, will create, Caesar is also, by all accounts, a man capable of being genuinely interested in places and situations beyond the immediate practical concerns of his mission. Alexandria, its library, its history, its unique position as a meeting point of Egyptian, Greek, and now increasingly Roman influences, is, she thinks, the kind of place that a man like Caesar might find genuinely interesting, beyond its immediate political significance. She thinks too about her own position, about what she represents as Egypt's queen, however contested that position currently is, and about what kind of relationship with Rome might actually serve Egypt's long-term interests beyond the immediate crisis. Egypt's relationship with Rome has been for generations one of increasing dependence. Roman support has been necessary for Ptolemaic rulers, including her own father, to maintain their positions in ways that have come at considerable cost to Egypt's effective independence, even as nominal independence has been maintained. Is there a different kind of relationship possible? Not independence from Rome. That ship, Cleopatra understands, has effectively sailed, given the realities of Roman power in this period. But perhaps partnership of some kind, a relationship in which Egypt's resources, its wealth, its strategic position, its cultural significance, are valued by Rome not simply as things to be extracted or controlled, but as contributions to a relationship that benefits both parties. This is, she recognizes, an enormously optimistic framing, given the realities of power between Rome and any of the various kingdoms and territories that exist in this period within Rome's sphere of influence or outright control. Rome's relationships with such territories have rarely been characterized in practice by anything resembling equal partnership. But she thinks about it nonetheless, not as a concrete plan, but as a kind of aspiration, a sense of what might be possible if circumstances allow, if the kind of communication and relationship building that her education emphasized proves relevant to whatever situation actually develops in the coming days. She does not know if she will have the opportunity to attempt any of this. The situation remains too uncertain. Her brother's faction controls Alexandria's government. Her own position, while not without resources and supporters, is genuinely precarious, and Caesar's own intentions upon arrival remain unknown. But she thinks about it, standing on her terrace, looking at the dark sea where his fleet approaches, preparing, in whatever way preparation is possible, for a situation whose specific shape she cannot yet know. The night around Cleopatra is filled with sounds, the particular layered soundscape of a large city at night, combined with the sounds of the sea and the harbor. From the city itself, the underlying hum of human activity that never entirely stops, even at night, in a population of this size. Occasional louder sounds, voices carried on the wind from somewhere in the city, too distant and too mixed with other sounds to make out specific words. The sound, periodically, of something that might be music, Alexandria's nightlife, even amid the current political tensions, apparently continuing in at least some quarters. Life proceeding in its ordinary ways even as larger events unfold. From the harbor, the sounds of water against the harbor walls, against the hulls of the ships at anchor. Alexandria's harbor is rarely empty. Vessels from across the Mediterranean typically present in some numbers, their presence audible as well as visible even at night. From the sea beyond the harbor, less distinct sounds, the general sound of waves, of wind across water, sounds that blend into a kind of background presence rather than anything specific. Cleopatra has always found these nighttime sounds of Alexandria, this particular combination of city and sea, of human activity and natural processes, to be in some sense the sound of home. The specific acoustic signature of this place, different from anywhere else that she has known her entire life. Tonight, listening to these familiar sounds, she finds herself thinking about how strange it is that everything could change, that the specific political situation, the question of who controls Alexandria, who occupies positions of power, could shift dramatically in the coming days. While these underlying sounds, this basic acoustic reality of the city, would likely remain largely unchanged, the sea would still sound like the sea. The harbor would still have its particular sounds of water against stone and hull. The city would still have its underlying hum of human activity, its occasional music, its voices carried on the wind. Political power shifts, kingdoms rise and fall, rulers come and go. Even the relationship between Egypt and Rome, however it develops, will eventually be one phase among many in the long history of this region. But the sounds, the sea, the harbor, the city's underlying life, these continue in some sense regardless, not unchanged exactly. Cities do change over time in ways that affect even their basic soundscapes, but continuing on a timescale that is different from the timescale of political crisis, political change. She finds in this thought something related to the earlier thought about the stars, a sense of different scales of time and significance existing simultaneously. The immediate crisis, urgent and significant on its own scale, and underlying continuities, the sea, the stars, the basic patterns of a city's life that exist on different scales, that will continue regardless of how the immediate crisis resolves. This does not make the crisis less important, but it provides, again, a kind of frame, a way of locating the crisis within a larger context, without losing sight of its genuine significance within that context. At some point, Cleopatra's thoughts turn, as they inevitably must, however much the broader perspectives of stars and sea and continuity provide a kind of frame to the practical question of what tomorrow will actually involve. Caesar's fleet, based on the most recent reports, could arrive within the next day, possibly tomorrow itself, possibly the day after, depending on weather and the specific progress of the ships. When the fleet arrives, what happens next is, in significant part, beyond Cleopatra's direct control. The faction controlling Alexandria's government, her brother's faction, under Pothinus's effective direction, will presumably be the first to interact, formally, with Caesar's representatives, simply by virtue of controlling the city's formal governmental apparatus. What that faction will do, how they will present the situation, including presumably eventually the fact of Pompey's death, which Caesar may or may not already be aware of, Cleopatra does not know with certainty, though she has her suspicions, based on what she knows of Pothinus's general approach and the calculations that led to Pompey's killing in the first place. Her own position, outside the formal structures currently controlling Alexandria, though not without her own resources and supporters, including some military forces that remain loyal to her, currently positioned not far from the city, gives her, potentially, options that are different from simply waiting for events to unfold according to her brother's faction's management. She has been considering, again without finalized plans, given the genuine uncertainty, whether there might be some way to ensure that she, personally, has the opportunity to communicate directly with Caesar, rather than relying entirely on whatever framing of the situation her brother's faction provides. This is, she is aware, a considerably risky proposition. Direct communication with Caesar, bypassing the formal channels currently controlled by her brother's faction, could be seen as provocative, could potentially escalate tensions in ways that prove counterproductive. But it could also, if circumstances allow, if the approach is handled carefully, provide an opportunity that might not otherwise exist. An opportunity to ensure that her own perspective, her own position, is not simply lost within whatever narrative her brother's faction presents. She does not have a specific plan for how this might be accomplished. The practical logistics, how exactly she might arrange to communicate with Caesar, given her current position and the security considerations involved, remain to be worked out, depending on how the situation actually develops once the fleet arrives. But she is thinking about it, has been thinking about it, in various forms for days now, as the reports of the approaching fleet have made this entire situation increasingly immediate, increasingly real, rather than simply a possibility to be considered in the abstract. Tomorrow, or whenever the fleet actually arrives, she will need to respond to whatever the actual situation presents. Tonight, standing on this terrace, she can only think, prepare in whatever ways preparation is possible, and wait. There is, Cleopatra has noticed, a particular quality to moments like this one, moments before significant events, when everything that can be prepared has been prepared, or as much as circumstances allow, and what remains is simply waiting. She has experienced this quality before, during her period of exile, waiting for news of developments in Alexandria, during various moments throughout the recent civil war, when outcomes of battles or negotiations remained uncertain, and all that could be done was wait for resolution. There is something in this waiting that she has come to recognize as having its own particular character, different from the active engagement of dealing with a situation once it has actually developed, but also different from genuine rest, genuine absence of concern, a kind of suspended attention, aware fully of the significance of what is approaching, but unable in this moment to do anything more than simply be present for the waiting itself. Tonight, on this terrace, looking at the dark sea, listening to the familiar sounds of the city and harbor, feeling the warm breeze off the water, Cleopatra experiences this suspended attention. Tomorrow will bring whatever it brings: Caesar's fleet, the responses of various factions, the beginning of whatever process will determine the next phase of Egypt's relationship with Rome and her own position within Egypt's ongoing internal conflicts. But tonight, this specific night, exists in its own right, not simply as the night before something else, though it is certainly that, but also as itself. This particular evening, this particular view of the sea and stars, this particular moment of her own life, 21 years old, standing on a terrace she has known since childhood, in a city that has been her home for her entire life, waiting for events that will, in all likelihood, change everything, while the sea continues its ancient patterns and the stars continue their ancient movements, indifferent to human timescales and human concerns. She remains on the terrace for a while longer. She does not know exactly how long, time having taken on the particular quality it sometimes does during periods of waiting, when ordinary measures of duration seem less relevant than the simple experience of the present moment. Eventually, she will return inside, will presumably attempt to sleep, though sleep on a night like this may prove difficult, the mind continuing to process and consider, even as the body seeks rest. But for now, she remains on her terrace in the warm night air, looking at the dark Mediterranean, where somewhere, beyond the range of sight, ships continue their approach, carrying a man whose arrival will, in ways that cannot yet be fully known, shape the course of her own life and the life of the kingdom she rules. Eventually, Cleopatra turns from the terrace's edge. The attendants, who have remained at their discreet distance throughout her time here, become more attentive as she moves, though they say nothing, simply present, as attendants are present, ready to assist with whatever she requires. She walks back toward the palace's interior, through archways, along corridors she has known her entire life, past the kind of decoration and architecture that represents centuries of Ptolemaic rule, the accumulated wealth and artistic patronage of generations of her dynasty. Her own chambers, when she reaches them, are quiet, prepared for the night, as they are prepared every night, by the attendants whose responsibility this is. She does not immediately lie down to sleep, stands for a moment near a window that, like the terrace, offers a view toward the sea, though from this angle lower and more enclosed, the view is more limited, mostly darkness, with only the lighthouse's distant fire clearly visible. She watches that fire for a moment, steady as it always is, continuing its ancient function regardless of what tomorrow brings. Then she moves away from the window, prepares, in whatever ways preparation for sleep involves, for rest, though her mind, she suspects, will continue to process the events of recent days, the uncertainties of tomorrow, even as her body seeks the rest it requires. Tomorrow will bring Caesar's fleet, or perhaps the day after, depending on factors beyond anyone's control. Tomorrow will bring whatever response her brother's faction makes, whatever opportunities or dangers that response creates. Tomorrow will bring the beginning of a relationship between herself and Caesar, between Egypt and Rome, whose specific character cannot yet be known, but whose significance for her own life and for the kingdom she rules will likely prove considerable. But tonight, this specific night, with its warm air and its sea sounds and its ancient lighthouse burning steadily in the darkness, tonight is simply tonight, a night for rest, as much as rest is possible, a night for the suspended attention of waiting, before whatever comes next actually arrives. Let your own breathing slow now, all the way down. Feel the weight of your body settling into rest, like a great ship finally reaching harbor after a long voyage, finding calm water at last. Tomorrow may bring change, significant change, change that cannot be fully predicted or controlled, but tonight is for rest, for the simple presence of this moment before whatever comes next. In and out, in and out. The sea continues its ancient rhythms. The lighthouse burns steadily, guiding whatever approaches towards safe harbor. The stars continue their slow movement across the sky, indifferent to human timescales, continuing as they have always continued. And in a palace overlooking an ancient harbor, a young queen prepares for sleep, for whatever rest is possible on a night before everything might change. Tomorrow will come, as tomorrow always comes, but tonight there is only this, the warm air, the sound of the sea, the steady light of an ancient lighthouse, and rest, however it comes, for however long it lasts, before the new day begins, down and down, into the deep, uncertain but necessary sleep of someone facing an unknown tomorrow, with whatever courage, whatever preparation, whatever hope is possible. Sleep well, traveler. The lighthouse is burning, and tomorrow will come, as it always does,